Castlevania Symphony of the Night is generally considered one of the greatest games of all time, and it's not hard to see why. Stepping away from its predecessor's formulas of tough linear action platformers, Symphony of the Night would return to the more exploratory style of the overhated second game in the franchise, while taking obvious inspiration from Metroid 2, the Vania and Metroidvania if you will, and a style Castlevania would mostly retain after. Unlike Metroid though, Symphony of the Night also incorporates heavy RPG elements. The intention was to increase accessibility. Not only are you rewarded for exploring, getting not only permanent upgrades, but new equipment as well as experience, replacing some element of skill with the ability to just become stronger around it. Symphony originally released on the PlayStation, but has had various re-releases. The Saturn version adds a few new items, a boss fight, and a playable character. The Xbox 360 arcade just features the PlayStation version, and the PSP version, bundled as an unlockable on Castlevania the Dracula X Chronicles, reintroduces the Saturn changes, but with some tweaks. For the purposes of this video, I played the Xbox 360 port of the original and the PSP version, which honestly ended up being mostly unnecessary, but I can't complain too much because the game is great. Before I talk about gameplay, this game is in a lot of ways a direct sequel to the last, so to briefly recap, the formerly Japanese exclusive Castlevania Rondo of Blood, Richter Belmont, then the latest in the long line of vampire-slaying Belmonts, defeats Dracula but goes missing after, and as he does, Dracula's castle returns, leading Dracula's half-human son Alucard to investigate. The gameplay of Symphony of the Night is largely simple, which is a benefit to its structure. On its face, Alucard only has a few options. He can jump, he can backdash, a dodge move that shoots him backwards to avoid attacks, and he has 2 attack buttons. He can hold various weapons that have unique properties, be it swords, two-handed swords that take up both buttons, shields, maces which have slightly different attacking patterns, and on and on. Having 2 hands gives a lot of options, different weapons for different situations, a classic sword and shield to avoid projectile spam, or even holding healing items in one hand and a weapon in the other. Alucard also has access to the series' traditional sub-weapons. He can only hold one at a time and uses them by pressing up and attack. They have simple uses, but tend to hit areas Alucard normally can't. The holy water makes fire on the ground, the axe goes upward in arc, and so on, although each use costs hearts, a collectible dropped by enemies or destructible objects. There are more complex actions. For example, most weapons have some kind of special move. The Alucard sword allows Alucard to teleport behind opponents for a few hits, the shield rod can imbue his shield with power, and tons more. All is little hidden secrets, but most of these more complex actions are unlocked through exploration, which in turn further said exploration. Some, like Soul the Bat, which lets Alucard become a bat, are necessary to progress through the game, while others only open side areas, aid in combat, or make traversal easier in other ways, slowly upping the complexity of the game as more and more of the castle is revealed. The castle itself is the real star of the game, immaculately designed for exploration. While the game funnels Alucard through the first segments to get him up to speed, once he reaches Long Library and can open locked doors, the game begins to expand out exponentially, allowing pretty much free reign of every area, especially after the bat is obtained. Some areas are deadlier than others, so it's usually pretty obvious where you're supposed to be, or at least where you're not supposed to be, but there's also very little stopping you from reaching whatever you want save a few upgrades. Secrets are also everywhere and well worth finding. Most have some kind of clue, cracked walls, weird entryways that aren't listed on a map, which can be accessed at any time with selects, no clunky menu navigation thank god, or through the use of familiars, summonable allies which indicate spots, although a handful of these secrets can be pretty obtuse. These secret areas almost always have something worth getting, upgrades, new moves, maximum health increases and the like, as well as unique weapons or armor. Another great thing is the ease of getting around. Dead ends are rare. Most every area connects to at least 2 others, and there's plenty of shortcuts and loopbacks that make getting around easier, besides the teleporters spread around that can at least get you pretty close to where you need to be from pretty much wherever you are. The castle is also populated with cool and unique enemies and bosses. Early enemies are pretty passive, like zombies that shamble about, but later enemies tend to be a lot more aggressive, give chase, and throw out all sorts of projectiles. The bosses tend to be not great. There's a few standouts, but it's mostly a war of attrition. Survive however you can to chip away at the big guy and force your way through, hopefully gaining a level up for your trouble. Level ups are hardly worth mentioning, they give passive bonuses to stats as you go, but at a pretty reasonable rate that ensures that you don't end up hitting a wall or something like that. There's no choice or min-maxing, it just happens passively. I guess what I'd have to say is that the game is great to explore. It's open and free, and there's really no wrong answer to where to go. Even if you're not moving towards progress, you're learning the castle, finding shortcuts, seeing things that you can open or explore later, finding new weapons or other secrets. My only 2 complaints are relatively minor. 1, the map isn't very detailed, and I'm not talking about them missing information and not showing areas a visitor to the castle would never see, like the underground. I mean, the only things marked on the map are saves and warps. It'd be nice if different areas of the map were indicated in some way, or if boss rooms got marked somehow to help you landmark where you are, but the ease of pulling up the map largely mitigates the issue. Secondly, combat isn't very good. Most enemies are minor obstacles, and the fact that you blow through them as you progress really shows how you grow and improve, so just slashing through them is fine. But outside of a few bosses, most of them directly at the end of the game, most bosses are kinda just damage sponges that blast attacks everywhere. What you have equipped is far more important than good play, which is rewarding for an exploration standpoint and a lot less so in the context of an action game. That said, I don't really mind it because what I love is the exploration, and on that end the game is absolutely perfect. Another area the game is basically flawless in is visuals and audio. This is one of the few 2D games on the original PlayStation, hell, one of the few of the entire generation, and that fucking kills me. The power of the console let this thing come out beautifully. Alucard is amazingly detailed, the flapping cape, the fluid movements, each sword having its own colors and particle effects, the way his cape leaves a sudden motion trail. He exudes a grace and agility from just the simple sprite work alone. Enemies and especially bosses have a similar level of detail, big, detailed, really cool and colorful designs. I love the really big bosses, especially the giant corpse pile. Each area is given a unique identity, not just in visual design, although that is great. Long libraries, warm and filled with books, still inhabited by one of the game's only friendly NPCs. The Catacombs are sickly green, but also have the fiery lava areas to break them up. And Olrox's quarters are made of clean marble. The attention to detail is great, but each area also has fitting and unique enemies. Like the inverted long library, which has enemies based on the Wizard of Oz. It's a really nice, odd little detail that helps tie the areas together in another visual way. The audio is also next level, not just in the beautiful music, which features new, calming remixes of older songs from the series, but plenty of new renditions as well, focused on a quiet, calm, but eerie atmosphere with a few more exciting tracks for the real dangerous fight scenarios. While sound effects are mostly standard stuff, the save room, which has this really weird rotoscoped thing hanging in the middle, which is pulsing to a heartbeat, really stands out. It's creepy, but over time it grows to be a comforting pulse between dangerous areas. The voice acting is pretty strong, I think. Everyone has become iconic in their roles. Silly and over the top for sure, but really great, and there's some absolutely classic lines.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets! But enough talk! Have at you!
The PSP version does retranslate the game, giving it a more accurate, usually less clunky script, like removing this iconic line, but they did manage to get all the voice actors back, which is really neat. So yeah, like most of the gameplay, this game looks and sounds basically flawless. So like, as for talking about the game in depth, the back and forth exploratory nature makes it kind of tough, so I'm kind of just gonna do what I can, skip the backtracking, talk about the interesting stuff. Glance over the bosses mostly, I don't know. The game begins in a prologue recapping the end of Rondo of Blood, with Richter fighting off Dracula in both his humanoid and giant demonic forms. This is just the end of Rondo of Blood, except if you run out of health, Maria heals you. You get to play as Richter for a bit. It's just a recap for people who haven't played Rondo, that's what it's there for. Symphony Night has a fantastic intro. After arriving inside the castle's ground, Alucard breezes through some enemies with his full set of Alucard gear, sword, shield, and armor. There's very little risk of enemies at first, but directly inside the castle proper, Death, the literal Grim Reaper, and Dracula's right-hand man, comes and steals Alucard's gear, leaving him defenseless. It's pretty much a staple in the genre now, show you a taste what it'll be like to be powerful and yank it all away, which also has the weird effect of making this one of the harder parts of the game. Upgradeless and armorless, death comes fast. The game is largely a bit of a cakewalk, a handful of bosses can cause some issues, and there's another fairly notable section later, but exploring for good items and leveling up naturally will kinda let you tank through most stuff. At this point the game is basically linear, there's a few side rooms, but without any upgrades there's really no way of getting to places the game doesn't expect you to be. Speaking of which, the first relic is here, a permanent upgrade named the Kibuzo, which causes destructible items and enemies to drop pickups. Parts for sub-weapon use, sub-weapons themselves, or money, which is necessary, so this upgrade is required eventually. There's no reason not to get it when you're there. The Alchemy Lab is largely vertical, I mean, the whole game kinda is, but this section really wants to teach you about going up. It also wants to beat you down with the first boss of the game, a 1 vs 2 against Slogra and Gaibon. Slogra tries to spear you to death, Gaibon flies around carrying Slogra to you, or shooting fireballs. It's still early enough that these big dudes can shred Alucard pretty fucking quick, but their AI isn't too good. If you hide under the overhang on the right, stab at Slogra, Gaibon picks him up, drops him in front of you, and you repeat. Killing one or the other might give you a level up, which helps, and after you just need to shred Gaibon. Like every boss, defeating them gives a permanent health upgrade, the first step to becoming overpowered. The Marble Gallery afterwards is more or less a pass-through for now. There's a lot of really important areas connected to here that get teased by locked doors, areas just out of reach, and an appearance in one of the game's few NPCs, Maria, a woman who aided Richter in the previous game, who's come to the castle to find him after his disappearance. The clock room is crucial to later parts of the game, besides being a nice place to look at, but outside of leading to the next area, the Marble Gallery also has an optional relic, the Spirit Orb, which displays enemy damage numbers. It's mostly unnecessary information, but it's one of those little RPG things that allows you to kinda determine how good a weapon is by seeing if it's going through an enemy's defenses and whatnot. The outer wall is more or less a transitionary area. It's a vertical wall on the east side of the map that serves to connect a few separate areas. Of every area, it's one of the few areas that lacks much for secrets, although it does have an optional boss, Doppelganger 10, an exact clone of Alucard who uses his sword and sub-weapons against him. This is the first boss that can pretty reasonably just be tanked and out-damaged, but he can be tricky and hits hard. The stopwatch sub-weapon stops him dead in his tracks, which is an easy solution, but not incredibly satisfying. The area also contains the Soul of Wolf, the relic that allows Alucard to become a wolf. This ability borders on completely useless. It's slow, awkward to use, and only necessary in the case of going for full completion at the very end of the game. Here it's only used to get one singular health upgrade moderately earlier than you would if you went through it with any, like the bat or any other required upgrade that you'll get. While the clock tower is technically accessible, it comes to a rather abrupt end and it has gaps Alucard can't cross. Granted, these drop him to a lower floor. There's no instant death in the game, unlike older games, which makes it feel a lot nicer to experiment and explore without the risk of instant death. The only avenue left to explore is the Long Library, a really chill area that has living books and giant germs, plus the fairy card, a relic that displays enemy names for some reason. The atmosphere is really nice, and at the back is the shop. The librarian will sell Alucard goods, mostly just weapons and armor. The Diamond Mill is some of the best armor in the game before the end game, but there are two important things to get here. The Jewel of Open opens exactly 2 locked doors, allowing access to either the underground or upper levels. It's impossible to move very far without this item. Meanwhile, the castle map isn't technically necessary, but it certainly helps as it displays all the areas that Alucard hasn't been to, save a few. The next step is to backtrack through pretty much everything that's already been done to the Alchemy Lab, which becomes notably easier thanks to some levels and equipment. The game has a very good sense of progression in that way. The Jewel of Open allows access to the Royal Chapel. This is another area that can be fairly difficult, surely because of the distance between checkpoints throughout the area. The stairs have enemies that are really easy to get caught off guard by, the spectral sword swings swords everywhere to make it hard to dodge around, and the vertical climbs in the latter half are capped off with enemies flying every which way to knock you down. Towards the end of the chapel is the Hippogriff. If bosses were giving you issues, this is probably the end of that for a while. You can easily tank its flames and swoops and outdamage it with minimal effort, with most of the bosses after being of a pretty similar caliber. The reason for coming all the way out here was the castle keep. There's a teleporter here that leads back to the beginning area, serving as a shortcut, as well as a secondary entrance to the clock tower, although it's easily the most dangerous area in the castle, to the point that I'll ignore it for now. The thing to get here is the leap stone, a double jump that opens up a ton of the castle on its own. So much of the castle's opened up, most of the underground area is the clock tower, but also the next area of use, Olrox's quarters, which can be accessed by waiting in the Marble Gallery's clock room for a bit, causing a statue to move. The quarters themselves are pretty limited in options for now, serving just as a lead into the Colosseum, the most bizarre addition to the castle, a full-blown dungeon and torture area capped off with, of all things, a gladiator pit. There's a ton to find in the various rooms, including the shield rod, which is extremely good much later, but still fairly usable here, boosted in power while holding a shield. The important part of the area is the bosses, the Minotaurus and Werewolf. It's a 2-on-1 fight, but honestly Alucard is too strong to have much trouble. More interesting is that Richter is here claiming to be the lord of Dracula's castle, and trying to slow Alucard to buy time to revive Dracula. It's a hell of a hook, but real answers are a ways off. Defeating the bosses also lets Alucard get the form of Misc, which lets him become Misc to pass through certain walls. Functionally it's just a key, but it does give Alucard brief invincibility as a clunky dodge in certain situations. The double jump also allows Alucard to reach the back areas of the Long Library. It's not much of an exciting area, but it does contain the first relic to unlock a familiar, the Fairy card. The Fairy is a weird familiar. It's non-combative, but works to heal Alucard through various items you can find, and will also occasionally point out secret areas. The back area also has the Lesser Demon fight. It's a fairly neat boss who summons enemies to fight for him, and beyond that fight is the Soul of Bat, the final transformation and freedom to go basically anywhere. The Bat can fly, and pretty much nowhere is off limits at this point. Above the clock room in another area, Alucard can get the optional but fantastic upgrade, the gravity boots, which allows Alucard to leap incredibly high up. It's never technically necessary, but it makes the slow flying of the bat more bearable. More importantly is the underground caverns, which could be reached earlier, but with everything we have, are fully explorable now. Because of this, there's a lot available down there. 2 bosses to start, first the Succubus, whose manipulative powers let us get some backstory and insight on Alucard and the loss of his mother, which is neat. But like many, the Succubus is a pushover. However, she leaves behind a gold ring that's necessary for progress later. The Scylla can also be found down here, optional but also worth it for the max health upgrade. By the standards of the game at this point, she's fairly threatening. Her giant snakes hit reasonably hard and her water attacks are hard to dodge, but like most everything at this point, she can't do damage faster than Alucard. Alucard loses health in water for some reason, so there's a bit of a danger in navigating the caverns, and at the far end he can get the merman statue, which causes the boatman to appear back near the Scylla, which allows him to get the holy symbol for water immunity. I'm fairly sure all this is technically skippable, but there's a lot of goodies in the water sections that make it pretty worthwhile. From the underground caverns, Alucard can also enter the abandoned mine. Truthfully, there isn't much for now. The Cerberus boss is a cakewalk, but the demon card is available, giving Alucard a new familiar. The demon is an offensive familiar, attacking enemies weak at first, but leveling alongside Alucard to become more powerful, as well as having the ability to push one singular switch near where it's found to allow access to a secret area. Before reaching the deepest layer of the castle, Alucard needs to return to Olrox's quarters and fight the man himself, a classy vampire based on Count Orlok, the villain of Nosferatu, who doesn't put up much of a fight, but upon his defeat transforms into a giant green alien thing. I don't really understand what it's supposed to be, or why it's like this, but he's kinda spooky with his spindly limbs. Still not challenging, nothing will be for a while. Beyond Olrox is the Echo of the Bat, an upgrade used precisely once to see in the dark in the lowest level of the castle, the Catacombs below the mines. Grand Falloon is an optional boss down here, and the coolest in the game in my opinion, a massive sphere of corpses that needs to be chipped to its center while fighting off its hordes. It's effectively impossible to lose if you're even, like, remotely leveled and have been exploring, but visually it's really cool. There are also 2 items to note. The Ice Brand, a sword that isn't really necessary but is the best sword in the game for a very long while, and the Spikebreaker armor. To get it requires using the Echo to fly through a dark room filled with spikes, and the Spikebreaker, like many late game upgrades, is used to exit this area and reach a hidden Maria cutscene in the chapel, which lets Alucard get the silver ring. The clock tower is the only major area left unexplored, and despite being late game, the sheer walls of Medusa heads flying around can still make it quite annoying. They do very little damage, but can turn Alucard into stone for increased damage, on top of sending him tumbling to the bottom of the towers. This area contains Fire the Bat, a weak, largely useless projectile for the bat transformation, as well as a boss fight against Colosseum, who probably should have just been translated to Crowman. Regardless, Alucard can basically kill any boss in seconds at this point. That's basically everywhere in the castle. There's a few semi-important things that still remain. The castle keep has the ghost card for the ghost familiar, as well as Power of Mist, which allows Alucard to remain in mist form for longer periods of time. Great for avoiding damage when moving around. While the Alchemist Laboratory has the bat card for the bat familiar, both of which are just offensive familiar options. The hidden area near the start of the game has the Power of Wolf Relic. The wolf gets a dash that at high speeds makes it invincible in damage dealing, making it kinda good for quick traversal, while also allowing it to swim, which is necessary for filling out a few spots on the map. And finally, by wearing both the gold and silver rings in the clock room, Alucard can find Maria one last time. In the PlayStation and Xbox 360 version of the game, she begs Alucard to help Richter and gives him the holy glasses, while in the Saturn and PSP version, she first demands to test him, making him fight her in a unique boss battle. She's actually fairly strong, she moves quickly and shoots at her animal friends to fill the screen, while acting fairly unpredictably, but still struggles to reliably deal damage due to how overpowered Alucard is basically assured to be at this point. With all that, it's time to face Richter in the Castle Keep, the first real challenge in a good while. His whip outranges most of Alucard's stuff, he glances off sub-weapons, and constantly spams his own, including item crashing them, which causes all of his sub-weapons to turn into screen-clearing super moves. The key is to defeat him quickly before he can really sink in, but even this is hard as he gets more powerful at low health. Killing Richter brings the game to a close. Dracula has been halted temporarily, but at great cost, and with the threat still looming. That is, unless you use the holy glasses Maria gave you, which allow you to fight Richter proper, or more specifically Shaft, the man controlling Richter. All you have to do is smash the orb that floats around him in his fight. It's honestly easier than fighting him for real, and you can free him of Shaft's control. Richter is too weak to go on, so you're sent ahead to the final area, the Inverted Castle. As the name implies, it's the same place but upside down. Makes sense why every outdoor area had a ceiling now. The Inverted Castle gets a lot of flack for being filler, and I mean, it is. It's the same content but upside down, and you need to aimlessly wander about to boss rooms to fight bosses to get Dracula's body parts to move on. That said, it's not horrible after the first few minutes. Enemies and bosses have all changed. Old bosses like Colosseum are now common enemies alongside new stronger enemies than the regular castle. Plus every boss in this section is new, and secret areas have been repopulated with new items, weapons, and upgrades, including the original Alucard gear, which is really good, especially the shield, which when used with the shield rod deals 255 damage on contact with an enemy about 5 times a second. If you really want, this kills every boss in seconds, although I'd recommend not abusing it on them. Plus gives Alucard temporary invincibility and heals him after each kill. It's horrifically overpowered, but makes getting around tolerable, as a lot of rooms in the inverted castle are just wall-to-wall enemies. It kind of feels like the whole inverted castle was a little bit rushed. It's a huge difficulty bump, you will walk into it and die fast, but you'll level up fast too and eventually end up overpowered again, especially using the Alucard shield to get around. I'm not exactly sure which of the bosses hold the items needed to progress, and I'm too lazy to look it up, but I'd be hard-pressed to say most are notable, and I don't want to extend this too much. So to speedrun, the Royal Chapel has Medusa. She can turn you to stone and royally fuck you up, plus uses a shield to block attacks. She's a real rough fight before all the new levels start to pile up, given that she's probably the first one you'll fight. The underground caverns have the Alucard shield, while the underground mine has the fight with Death, who we saw way back at the beginning. Genuinely great and challenging. In both phases he looks cool as fuck. In his first he floats around tossing sides, but in the second he becomes a bizarre skeleton creature. He attacks up close, but he can also throw his arms if you try to play keep away, requiring aggression and dodging. Once you get past Death, you'll pretty much be leveled up to not have to be very careful anymore. You'll pretty much be back in overpowered territories. The Catacombs have a new relic, the Gas Cloud, which makes Alucard's extended mist form poisonous, damaging enemies as he travels, which is neat if a bit useless since you could already just pass through enemies in the power of mist form. I guess you get a little bit of experience as you go, but... The boss Galmoth is gigantic, but really easy, mostly just standing around waiting to die slowly. Returning to the underground caverns, the Force of Echo makes the bats echo damaging, mostly useless, while Doppelganger 40 appears as a boss, same fight with bigger numbers and a few new tricks. Still really cool, but not a huge threat. The Alchemist Laboratory has Beelzebub. He's gigantic and stationary, but has hordes of bugs that attack Alucard for him. He needs to be chopped to pieces to kill him, which is neat. I think he's actually kind of tough. His bugs can be a pain to play around because they kind of just keep coming and coming. The outer wall has the creature, based on Frankenstein's monster. Sonic the Hedgehog rolls around back and forth pretty mindlessly. It makes me laugh, but it's hardly a fight given how much damage you can tank at this point. Finally, the Clock Tower has Darkwing, a giant bat that is extremely easy to deal with. The Colosseum has doppelgangers of Trevor Grant and Sypha, the protagonists of Castlevania 3. All three attacking together can be fairly overwhelming, but like a lot in this game, they can be bashed through fairly quickly while Alucard just glances off damage. Achmedon 2, a mummy, is in Olrox's quarters and may very well be the easiest boss in the game. And with that, that's pretty much the inverted castle experience. I mean, you kind of just whiz through it. You have all the upgrades. There's nothing stopping you from going wherever you want, and if you know what you're looking for, you can kind of just blast through this part in 20 minutes. With that, it's, you know, everything to go finish things. The secret room, which was previously under the clock room but is now above it, Alucard can go and confront Shaft. This battle and the one against Alucard's father are all in a row. It can actually push Alucard's endurance a bit, especially because they are heavy hitters. Shaft himself floats in a giant orb that needs to be shattered, while his smaller orbs attack, and the variety makes them pretty spicy. Some stick to walls and floors and shoot flames, some ricochet around, and others need to be avoided by misting around them. Shaft isn't too tough, but Dracula certainly can be if he wants. Dracula's in a new form. He looks kinda not that good. His demonic form from the prologue is visually much cleaner and way cooler, and the fight from the background thing is a little clunky. Alucard needs to mash away while dodging Dracula's hands on either side, which he occasionally swipes in, and after a bit he'll begin tossing spells all over. The space is cramped, so avoiding damage can be tough. The mist helps a lot. I like the boss a lot. It's a bit damage spongy, but powerful and intense to cap off the game, and it ends on a moment that's surprisingly sweet, with Alucard recounting his mother's final words, her forgiveness of humanity for killing her because of Dracula, and her promise to always love him, with Dracula accepting that death means seeing her again.
She also said to tell you that she would love you for all of eternity.
Lisa, forgive me! Farewell, my son!
It's a bit sudden, to say the least. You know, Dracula comes back to life for 3 minutes, and then accepts that he was a bad guy, dies. But, you know, it's a nice moment that was set up in the succubus fight earlier, and it kind of caps off the whole thing. Afterwards, Alucard, Maria, and Richter watch the castle collapse, and Alucard resigns himself to exile for humanity's sake. Although if map completion is at least 150% out of 200.6%, Maria will chase after him to try to get him to stay. And that's finally everything except for Richter Mode. It's more or less what it sounds like. You play the game as it was again with minimal changes, but as Richter, pulled from Rondo of Blood with minimal changes himself. Richter Mode has its ups and its downs. Having a new character to mess with is great, and Richter is a lot of fun to play as, but he's stripped of pretty much every RPG element. He can still increase his maximum health with health pickups, but as for everything else, he comes stock. He has a whip, which, to be fair, is extremely powerful, but falls off towards the end a bit. He can slide, as well as jump out of it to get around faster. He has an uppercut to go upwards. This is necessary to reach areas that Richter otherwise can't reach, usually by chaining these over and over, and since he has these from the start, he can basically just go directly to the inverted castle and then directly to the end of the game. Richter's final move is the item crash, where he utilizes the sub-weapons as super moves for a large amount of hearts. When holy waters crash, for example, it causes rain that highly damages all enemies on screen to the point it 1 or 2 hits every boss in this mode and borders on a necessity. Richter can explore much of the castle. I think his maximum percentage is somewhere in like 195%, 196, something like that. That said, Richter doesn't have any requirements for progression. He can just go to the inverted castle, go to the clock room, and fight Shaft, who serves as his final boss. It's a fine bonus mode. Richter is a lot of fun to control, even if he obviously doesn't belong in this setting. He needs to use his janky uppercut chains to get around, dies incredibly fast, and one-shot stuff at the start before coming crashing down near the end, being crushed entirely by item crashing. It's a fun, brief side mode, a nice Easter egg, but not much more. And I'll just be done pretending that's it, because we got one more mode, Maria Mode, adding the Saturn and PSP versions of the game, with slightly different versions of Maria for each. In the Saturn version, which I didn't play, she's a new version that acts as a modified Richter, while in the PSP version, she's actually carried over from Rondo of Blood. Maria is pretty unfortunate in this game. She operates completely different from the others and falls off very hard for it. Her primary attack calls up birds that fly out then back. Their range is about the same as Richter's whip, but they come out much faster at the downside of being fairly weak, especially in the inverted castle, where they become virtually useless as they can't do any meaningful damage through most enemies' defenses and huge health bars, meaning she instead needs to rely on her sub-weapons, her animal summons. Unlike the other two characters, she has unique sub-weapons and can hold 2 at a time, switching between them at will. Each of her animal buddies has different uses and a unique item crash. The tiger charges forward and bounces off enemies in front of him to hit up to 4 times, and when Crash powers up her attacks, the bird shoots fire diagonally upward in both directions and crashes into a projectile spamming phoenix, and so on. Even then, while these are enough to get her past enemies, bosses, especially the later ones, still give her a ton of trouble. The dragon seems to be the strongest, but even it's still fairly weak. Shaft is a huge pain especially. Maria can't dodge attacks like Alucard can, nor are her crashes strong enough to virtually instant kill Shaft like Richter. Again, like with Richter, I'm not going to complain too much. It's a bonus mode that isn't meant to be taken seriously. It's really not balanced for her, and her playthrough is far less fun than either of those, but I appreciate it as a little bonus side mode thing. And that leaves 3 brief things to cover. Konami magazine in 1997 featured a single-page manga called Nocturne in the Moonlight, acting as a prequel that show Alucard and Dracula's recollection of Alucard's mother's death. The art is nice, but it can be read in literally seconds. Similarly, the very brief manga from the Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight artwork book shows to serve Maria and Alucard finding Dracula Castle. It can also be read in seconds, but it has very nice art. In 2008, Symphony of the Night also got an audio drama, Akumajo Dracula X Suyoku no Yasokokyu. Not sure about that one, I tried. I gave it a fucking shot. A sequel taking place shortly after the game, which follows Alucard and Maria, plus eventually Richter, dealing with another vampire living in the town they settled in. I don't speak Japanese, so the audio part of it is lost to me, but it seems to be well acted, and the story is serviceable as a follow-up, despite not advancing the characters much. I don't actually have a lot to say about it. I read the translation of it, it's fine. Anyway, that finally wraps up everything that I wanted to talk about. Symphony of the Night got a slow start on release. Why would someone want a 2D game in the 3D era? But after good word of mouth, fantastic reviews, and some time, the game would be a smash hit and basically shape the series from then on. Classic-styled Castlevania games would still come out occasionally, mostly as small spin-offs like Rebirth on the Wii, but the mainline games would take after the style established here, with a bunch of great releases all in the Metroidvania style popping out until Konami at a Konami moment and killed the franchise entirely. Regardless, it started its own Castlevania renaissance, and it's extremely easy to see why Castlevania Symphony of the Night is so revered. It's amazing, it's beautiful, the soundtrack is insane, and the castle is a joy to explore, which is the main crux of everything great. There's always a secret to find, some platforming to do, or a new upgrade to open the game up further, held up really well by the RPG stuff. There's a few minor issues, combat is pretty dull, and the game is almost always way too easy because of poor balancing, with some huge spikes of difficulty occasionally when the balancing shifts in new areas. If you can get past these extremely little things, and I recommend that you do, it's basically a perfect game. It's hard to say much more. It's as good as it's been built up to be, pretty much perfect. I'd recommend the perfectly emulatable PSP version. It comes with Rondo, it has a little extra content, but really no matter how you play, Symphony of the Night is a fucking masterpiece. There's really not much more to say about it.